Please give it up for Elizabeth Allison. Dr. Elizabeth Allison is Epistemological Expedition into
vertiginous animate terrain.
Vertiginous animate terrain. Learn something new every day.
Thank you very much, Lily. Thanks everyone for being here in the warm late afternoon. I know I'm standing between you and free time, but I do hope you'll indulge me for the next hour or so. What I want to share is my current book project that I have been working on for quite some time, and it's taken many forms, many revisions. So keep in mind that all good writing is rewriting and rewriting and rewriting. And so we'll be really interested in your thoughts and comments at the end as I continue to rewrite. But it's really in process these days. Before I really begin, I want to follow the Bhutanese tradition of acknowledging and expressing gratitude at the beginning of any ceremony. In Bhutan, they'll do what's called a marchang ceremony before any sort of public event or inauguration of something. And particularly in the context of my talk, I really want to acknowledge the land, first of all, like our earthly home, and in particular, the mountains, both the Himalayas and the Sierra Nevada here in California, that have nurtured me and taught me so much. And I also want to acknowledge this particular piece of land here at Bishop's Ranch, which is hosting us and holding us so nicely this week with our human and non-human supporters cooking and caring for us. But it was also at this particular piece of land where I was able to get through a real sticking point in this book project. I attended a writing retreat here a couple of years ago, led by the poet Lori Glover. And I had this problem that I had been wrestling with for literally years in this project, and I could not get past it. And it was the container and the guidance of Lori, but it was also the land. I went out walking on the land, and I found a bench to sit on, and all the answers came to me with this problem that has really allowed the project to move forward. I mean, I might have been stuck, Becca's gone, but I might have been stuck in BPM 3, and the land really helped me move forward in that. So I want to express my gratitude, and also to the Pomo people who have cared for this land for millennia, as well as the family then who took on this land and has cared for it and then converted it into a retreat center, and as well as the PCC and ESR communities, students, faculty, staff, present and past, who have really influenced my thinking. I hope you'll see that here. And of course, my interlocutors in Bhutan who have shared so much with me. So the context here is where we are now, doom and gloom 101, right? The sad, bad news. We're in this age of climate chaos, ripped from the headlines a week ago when I was putting this presentation together. We here in the Bay Area, we're in the midst of a ridiculous heat wave where it was over 100 degrees at the same time that Hurricane Milton was coming in and Hurricane Helene had just devastated Asheville and so much of the eastern seaboard. As you know, Sean alluded to the other day that we have reached a point where the average air temperature is about 1.5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial times. So there's a heat map here of the anomalous air temperatures in 2023, and the darker red, of course, is where it's hotter. Plastic pollution, like plastics filling the ocean, you can see here. Microplastics then getting into our water supplies and even our blood and even mother's milk. And this week, right now, the Conference of the Parties for the Convention on Biological Diversity is meeting in Cartagena, I believe. Cali, thank you. Yeah, Cali, Colombia. And to look at the situation of biological diversity and how we're protecting biological diversity in advance of that meeting, which is known as COP16. More than 85% of countries failed to submit their plans. So like we're not taking the action that we need to be taking on a large scale. And I know you all know that, but this is the context in which I'm offering what I want to offer today, and in which I'm thinking of this book project. So many of our teachers, many of our ancestors in some of the thinking we do here have suggested, as you well know, that we need a new way of being. It's been suggested that we are between stories, that we live within the story. We've heard some of that already. But the old stories don't work anymore. The mainstream religion narratives don't work for a lot of people. There's a lot of patriarchy and domination and colonialism and many problems in the mainstream religious traditions. And many people have moved away from them for a whole host of reasons. And yet we don't have a new overarching story to live into. So many of our forebearers in our thinking that we're doing have suggested that we're between stories. Thomas Berry, Mary Evelyn Tucker and John Grimm, Brian Swim have suggested we're between stories. We're in this period of a great unraveling that some people have called this age of climate chaos and pollution and biodiversity crash and unraveling. Joanna Macy has called for a great turning, towards a life-sustaining society. We need a new paradigm to support that. And of course, Thomas Berry and Brian Swim, as well as others, have called for a new story. We see the universe story, the journey of the universe, some kind of new story that we can live into. So within that context and thinking with those folks, I'm thinking at the more earthly level, what is the new story we can live into, or what is a new story that we can live into? I'm very influenced by one of my mentors, the environmental historian Carolyn Merchant, who taught at UC Berkeley for 3 or 4 decades and now lives about a mile away from me in Albany in the East Bay in a retirement home. And she's like in her mid-80s these days. So in Reinventing Eden in 2003, she proposed this idea of a partnership ethic that I've worked with some over the years. I think it's good, but not totally complete, but I'm going to offer this as a frame and as a thinking tool. So she said that we need equity between human and non-human communities. We need moral consideration for both humans and other species. We need respect for both cultural diversity and biological diversity. We need the inclusion of women, minorities, and non-human nature in our code of ethical accountability. I think we could expand that a little and nuance that, but this is what she wrote in 2003. And we need an ecologically sound management that is consistent with the continued health of both human and non-human communities. So it's a pretty good start. It's better than the dominant paradigm that we've got right now. We can certainly nuance this, but I've been thinking about this and working with this for years and wondering, but how can we get from the sad, bad news and the doom and gloom to this partnership ethic that Merchant is proposing? And in After the Death of Nature, which some of you are reading right now, that I pulled together with Ken Worthy and Whitney Bauman, 2 colleagues, I suggested that in order to get to this partnership ethic, we need to revise our ontology, our epistemology, our ethics, and our politics and social contract, which is obviously a tall order, and many people in the room are working on that in various ways, working on various building blocks of revising these aspects of Western society. So in this project, what models can help us imagine alternatives? Do we have to create these out of whole cloth? Do we have to bring these from our imagination, or are there existing models that we can draw on? I would like to suggest that there are existing models that we can draw on, and that Bhutan has been a very fruitful thinking partner for me, and like the land, the people, the culture, the religion. So this is the image from the first slide, Paro Taksang. This is a 17th century monastery and temple built on the very high cliff wall in the western part of Bhutan. It's built around a meditation cave that was thought to be used by Guru Rinpoche or Padmasambhava in the 8th century. He is believed to be the initiator of Buddhism in Bhutan. And when you talk to people in Bhutan, even today, all of history kind of goes back to when Guru Rinpoche introduced Buddhism in Bhutan in the 8th century. Guru Rinpoche means precious teacher. And he is considered to be a second Buddha in the Himalayas. He's as important as the Buddha for Himalayan Buddhism. So it looks like a beautiful image of a temple on a cliff. I want to give you a bigger, I want to zoom back and give you the bigger view. This is what I'm talking about, vertiginous terrain. Vertiginous means very steep and precarious. So this monastery and temple is in the middle of this cliff, and what you're seeing here is indicative of much of the terrain of Bhutan. It's very steeply mountainous. So one might come to the question, like, what was this guy even doing meditating there in the middle of this cliff? Well, the story says that the legend and the oral history says that Guru Rinpoche's consort, Yeshi Tsogul, took the form of a flying tigress to bring him to this cliff from Tibet. And so he landed in the middle of this cliff and chose that as a meditation spot. And I share that story because I think it really encapsulates so much that is unique and particular about Bhutan, that today people talk about that story. We have the flying tigress, this mythical, perhaps, or not, creature, this shape-shifting creature, because Yeshi Tsogul was a woman. She was the consort of Guru Rinpoche, but she took this other form to transport him there, and they flew through the air. So it's quite a fantastical story. And I think that this merging of legend and history is really present in Bhutan, and also a fruitful way to think. I mean, we've been hearing talks about the imaginal realm and different uses of the imagination, and I think we can see this in Bhutan as well as perhaps unseen realms, and realms that Western science can't understand. I can't understand. I'm asking for your help on that, actually, as we go through this. And so bringing together those sort of different ways of knowing in this context brings us into a different way of thinking about human-nature relationships, and culture and nature, and history and nature. And so what I want to suggest about Bhutan here is that we get a different understanding of nature through learning about how this culture understands nature. And here I want to contrast it with the so-called Western view of nature, or the Euro-American view of nature, which we have inherited in the present day, that Carolyn Merchant documents in her book, The Death of Nature. She talks about how our current understanding of the material world and of non-human nature arose out of numerous social, cultural, economic, religious, philosophical, political changes in the early modern era in Europe, and that we have continued with this inheritance. So in The Death of Nature, she talks about nature as being imagined as corpuscular or divisible. That is, it's made up of atoms, right? It's made up of little building blocks that can be recombined into different things. They can be rearranged, reconstituted. Nature, I mean, of course we know it's passive, right? It doesn't do anything. It's just there. It's inert. And so this idea of the death of nature is this kind of passive, non-agentic, inert, insensate nature that can be used as material stuff, can be used however we want. And because it's inert, it's predictable, it's manipulable, it's manageable. We even hear this in contemporary talk about, even actually in Merchant's partnership ethic, the management of nature, right? We have active management of parks and wild spaces, but this idea is that like it's not going to do anything. Like humans get to decide, and nature's inert. It's insensate. It doesn't really notice what we're doing to it, so we can use it for instrumental purposes. It's context independent. So again, like taking the building blocks of life, taking the DNA or the atoms, we can rearrange it, we can manipulate it, and that's okay. You just pull it out of the context and do other things with it. And nature or material is value free. It doesn't have any intrinsic value. Of course, environmental ethicists have been arguing against this point for decades, but historically, in the sort of dominant Western view of nature, there was no intrinsic or inherent value for trees or raccoons or salmon other than the economic value that they might have. So I want to hopefully that sounds like reasonably familiar, like even if you don't agree, you've encountered that in contemporary society. And I want to contrast that with what I observed in Bhutan over the last 20 years, which is a really different view of nature that is arising from the Bhutanese Buddhist context, which I'm going to talk a little bit more about in a moment. This is arising in a particular cosmology and, of course, the particular cultural and religious history, political history. But what I've observed is rather than being corpuscular and divisible, nature or all materials, all beings are interdependent. So there's an idea of interdependent co-arising or mutual causality in Buddhism that you may have encountered before, that nothing really has independent existence, but it's all arising and emerging together, and it's reliant on the other things that are happening at that particular time. I think there's a lot of resonance with Whitehead, right? The sort of concrete occurrences? Actual occasions, yes, actual occasions. Nature in this understanding is active and animated, so it has the ability to respond, which I'm going to talk about. It has agency. It senses human activities, and it has responses to those human activities. It is aware. It exerts agency. It instead of being context independent, it's interdependent because of the interdependent co-arising, and this requires then respect, even petitions, like requests to nature about something that a human might want to do, and requires seeking consent from nature. Will nature agree to this? And rather than nature being value free or having no intrinsic or inherent value, there is the value of life, which is very central to Bhutanese Buddhism, the value of not harming life, not killing, not taking life unnecessarily, as well as a soteriological value in terms of respecting nature. And by that I mean all other life, helps the human on their journey toward enlightenment and their own salvation for their next life. So not only do other living things have their own value of life, but they also have a value to the human as far as the human's life progressing. So I think it's quite a different view of non-human nature. I'm going to try to demonstrate some of the ways that this happens. And I think that this is a tool for thinking with. Obviously, Bhutan is a really different culture. I'm going to explain some of the ways that it's different. It's also a very small country, fewer than 1 million people. So right there, we can say, well, we've got 300 million people in America, like how, and so I'm offering this as a provocation and something to think with. If there's an alternative, what might it look like in my context or your context or another context? That's what I think is really helpful. So in terms of Buddhist cosmology, which is incredibly complicated, and of course people study for decades, and I'm drawing just a little bit here, but there are some really important pieces to know that influence how Buddhist people think about and interact with non-human nature. And very much of it is shown on this Sipa Korlo, this wheel of life that can be found outside many monasteries and temples throughout Bhutan. And monasteries and temples are everywhere in Bhutan. So imagine this like a billboard. This is like reminding you about what life is like in this cosmology and what you should do and not do. And it's sort of a guidance for life. So going clockwise from the top, we have the 6 realms of existence within Buddhist cosmology. So rather than in the sort of Western paradigm, we have humans, and we may or may not have God or gods, depending on your cosmology. There's 6 realms here, including gods, demigods, and then hungry ghosts, hell beings, and then coming close to humans again, animals, and then humans. Humans are here. This is the human realm. You can see the Buddha. So humans are in a very fortunate position because we can learn and study the teachings of the Dharma and perhaps escape this cyclical wheel of rebirth known as samsara. And the other realms are not as fortunate because they can't study the Dharma and perhaps escape this wheel. Although there's some debate about whether non-human animals can or not. I'm not going to go into that, but like maybe non-human animals also can learn the Dharma. Another thing that's interesting about this is these 3 lower realms of hungry ghosts, hell beings, and animals. So these are the lower realms, and then the upper realms are humans, gods, and demigods. But the gods and the demigods aren't as fortunate as the humans either, because their life is so pleasurable and abundant and peaceful. They don't have any need to study the Dharma and try to escape from samsara. So they're also caught in this realm, in this circle. So this is the context in which Bhutanese people are living. This is the Buddhist cosmology. And so it suggests that humans are caught in this inescapable realm of samsara, that they will continue to live these different lives until and unless they study the Dharma, become enlightened, and escape from this wheel. But it means that there's a constant movement of humans between these different realms, and constant rebirth. So that's another different cosmological idea from our dominant paradigm. Also in the middle, there's guidance about how not to live, to avoid the 3 poisons of greed, delusion, and hatred or anger that are depicted by this bird who has too much attachment, is too greedy to hold on tightly to whatever is in their life, the snake that is really quick to anger and expresses hatred, and the pig that is delusional because it will just sleep anywhere and it will eat garbage and it doesn't know the difference. So we're advised to avoid these these attitudes and these behaviors. So, like I said, this is kind of a billboard of like how to live that is everywhere. And where are we? We're in the Himalayas, in between India and the Tibetan Autonomous Region of China, in a very steep mountain area. I want you to see the topography here. This is the vertiginous terrain. The capital city is in the blue circle, and the location of Parotaksung is in the red circle there. And as I've been indicating, there's a different view of non-human nature. More than half of the Bhutanese territory is protected in parks and protected areas, shown on this map, which are also connected with wildlife corridors, so wildlife can move between them. So this is a very high percentage of protection of parks and protected areas for wildlife. There are also very high peaks. Gangkhar Punsam is the highest unclimbed mountain in the world, 75, 70 meters above sea level. So it would be a great mountaineering goal, but the mountains are off limits for climbing because they are the abodes of deities. Mount Jomalari is the home of a goddess. And the mountains, the snows and the ice, the water flows down from the mountain peaks throughout the mountains to a range of sacred aquatic sites. So we have alpine lakes, hot springs, river bends, and water springs that are both protected as sites of the meditations of Guru Rinpoche, like this sacred lake in Western Bhutan. They're also protected and revered as sites of where deities are particularly active, as the confluence of these two rivers in central Bhutan, the Mother River and the Father River, come together at this river confluence. And you can see a dzong, or a monastery, which is also an administrative building, there at the confluence because it's considered to be a very powerful place. The waters also spin prayer wheels that are sending prayers, Buddhist prayers, up into the ether to be received. And so the water participates in spreading the Dharma in this way. And then there are sacred springs, again, believed to be blessed by Guru Rinpoche, where people will collect holy water that can be used for ceremonies, used for healing, and is believed to be very precious. So friends here collecting some holy water. There are also local spirits and deities protecting the waters. And this is where I think it gets really interesting. This, for example, is a Tsoman who was the owner and protector of this lake in Ha in central Bhutan. And people know that if they pollute or disrupt the lake, they will earn her ire. So this is where I think that we have a very different worldview, right? We have a different set of beings who are involved in this ontology and epistemology. We have to expand the Western ontology to be able to encompass them. And indeed, these beings are throughout the landscape of Bhutan. They can be found in old trees, or uniquely shaped trees, in water springs, in forest groves. This, if you see the tall trees in the center of this photograph, people in this area in eastern Bhutan told me that they couldn't go into that part of the forest because that was protected by a forest spirit known as a Tsen. And so they had to leave that part alone, and they could harvest timber from around, but not in that central area. So you see that the trees in that central area had grown really tall, but elsewhere around there had been some harvesting for timber, and the foliage is not as tall. So this is sort of an indigenous management practice, protecting these areas. And these beings may be seen, they may be unseen. There are plenty of depictions of these beings, what they may look like. They can come to people in dreams. Some people say that they have seen them when they were not asleep. So they, I think these beings inhabit an interesting realm for the Western ontology to consider. This is, again, another forest domain of a protector deity in south central Bhutan, up on the hillside here, where people are not allowed to go past the point where the prayer flags are, because they will disrupt the deity. And so this sets apart many areas of Bhutan from human use. Here are some more depictions of a Tsin, a protector deity. And these depictions can be found in temples and monasteries. So this indigenous ontology blends together with the Bhutanese Buddhist cosmology. These are not strictly Buddhist beings, but they are incorporated into Buddhist cosmology. Here's another place where on this chorten, which is a container of sacred Buddhist relics, we see a picture of a lu, which is a spirit of prosperity and abundance. But this is an indigenous or pre-Buddhist spirit that is then overlaid onto the Buddhist practice. Oops. So I was telling Sarah Lisa the other day, it's hard to create a typology of the sacred spiritual ecology, because there's a bit of movement between these different categories, and they're not always strictly typological. But here you can see that that there's a mix of the indigenous pre-Buddhist spirits and deities, as well as religious protection by Guru Rinpoche and other religious leaders at multiple scales in Bhutan's spiritual topography and spiritual ecology. So I think the point in this slide is just that there's spiritual protection of the ecology at a range of scales, from water springs and individual trees to entire mountaintops and valleys. And likewise, those were the indigenous or pre-Buddhist spirits. Likewise, there are dynamics of Bhutanese Buddhism protecting the landscape, embellishing it by hiding sacred religious treasures in the landscape known as terma, enveloping whole valleys in sanctity. These are known as Belyul, and this is a process that Guru Rinpoche initiated, energizing the landscape through the meditation, as in the first slide of Paro Taksang, where Guru Rinpoche meditated, and then entrusting the landscape to the local deities, which is the indigenous deities that we just saw. So here are a few examples. Terma are religious treasures that are buried in the landscape or hidden in various ways for future spiritual adepts to find and reveal and share the wisdom of them. There's a famous story about these sacred treasures hidden in this place called the Burning Lake at Membertso. Also, Guru Rinpoche enveloped entire valleys in sanctity throughout the Himalayas as places of protection and renewal in times of crisis, which seems interesting to think about right now. This is Boomtang in central Bhutan. And then he and other spiritual adepts energized the landscape through meditation, like sending their energy into the landscape in these meditation sites, as well as entrusting landscape to these local protector deities. And this history is recounted in these sacred dances that are performed annually. They're called sechus. So it's a ritual that's repeated annually at different places throughout Bhutan that recounts this history, and this is an example. So these sacred sites have been recorded and codified in a number of books in Bhutanese and in Dzongkha, the national language of Bhutan, and a couple of them are in English. But this helps Bhutanese folks connect to these sacred sites across the country and records this history, which of course is changing with globalization and modern development. So as I said, we need to rethink ontology and rethink epistemology, and ontology and epistemology, of course, are intimately related. So how do we rethink epistemology in light of these dynamics of sanctity of the landscape and these protector deities and spirits? From the Western context, we need an enlarged epistemology that can encompass these multiple levels of beings, whether we look to religious oral history or traditional ecological knowledge, which has been discussed extensively by Fikret Berkes in his book Sacred Ecology. He terms it as a cumulative body of knowledge, practice, and belief related to human relationship with their ecological surroundings. Or we can look at religious praxis, like the ritual that I was just showing, the sechus that happen annually, as well as the practice of terma, of adding sacred treasures to the landscape, the practice of Bayul, of designating areas on the landscape as sacred protected regions. We can look at material culture, and the 13 traditional arts and crafts of Bhutan contain a ton of knowledge that's not necessarily literate knowledge or verbal knowledge, but is a way of interacting with the surroundings. These fabrics can be made with vegetable dyes. Of course, the fibers can be cotton or linen that's grown. So that's also a way of interacting with non-human nature. And then an idea that I'm developing presently is the idea of multi-sentience ethnography, which builds on a turn in anthropology of multi-species ethnography, where people are conducting anthropology or ethnography from multiple perspectives, trying to bring in the perspectives of non-human actors of multiple species to enlarge who counts and who has agency and how we think about actors on Earth. And so I'm wondering, can we enlarge that even further into a multi-sentience ethnography to incorporate these spirits and deities and these previous religious actors in Bhutan to give us a larger perspective about who participates in creation of life on Earth. So here are some of the traditional arts and crafts of Bhutan that have been nurtured and sort of codified over centuries. As I said, a way of maintaining ritual and spiritual practice, as well as a way of interacting with the landscape. The materials for these arts and crafts are emerging from the landscape. They're fruits of the landscape, and then they're created into beautiful, useful items for the household and for daily life. Then how do we rethink ethics in Bhutan based on this ontology and epistemology? Or how does Bhutan help us rethink ethics? So we have this relational ontology, this dependently arising or co-arising nature. So it's mutually constitutive that no earthly manifestations have any fixed or permanent or individual existence, because all is co-arising and mutually influencing. This is also an evolutionary ecological point of view, is that organisms emerge and evolve in an ecological context. They don't emerge separately. We heard Sarah Lisa the other day talk about the bee and the flower. They're dependent on one another. And likewise, all organisms evolve within their ecological context. And as I mentioned initially with the Cipocorlo, the inescapability of cause and effect is a central concept in Bhutanese Buddhism, that every action leaves a residue or a karmic stain, which causes people then to think differently about how to interact with non-human nature. If I smash this mosquito, like, I have extinguished a life, and what are the consequences for my karma? Obviously, that has to be weighed and balanced, but I think that it brings a greater awareness to different actions with non-human nature. And as I said, also this idea of petition and consent, like, can we harvest these trees? Can we build a building or a home here? These are questions that are posed and answers are sought. And then the idea of reincarnation around the wheel of existence, that for most of us, we will not become enlightened in this lifetime. We will not escape this wheel of samsara, but we might be born into one of these other realms. And so particularly this influences how Bhutanese people think about animals, because what if I'm born as a dog next time, or a coyote, or a bear? So then they're thinking, like, what if I take this animal's life? What's the consequence for me? So this is exemplified in this image of the four faithful friends that can be found very frequently around Bhutan. Again, sort of a billboard on how to live your life. These animals are helping each other reach the fruit on this tree. And they're also debating who is the oldest, because who can remember when the tree was the seedling, and who watched it grow up. But ultimately, even though they have those differences, they help each other reach the fruit. So I think that it's a very, it suggests a very communitarian ethic, that different beings help one another and work together on a collective goal, which, frankly, we could use a little more of right now. So during the COVID pandemic, I studied what was happening very carefully. I was initially very worried because there are relatively few doctors, not a super advanced medical system, and it seemed like things could go really awry. So I was like, this is a sort of separate project, but bringing in what I learned from that is that Bhutan did amazingly during the pandemic. There were no deaths from COVID for like 2.5 years. And there's a lot of reasons for that I'm not going to go into right now. But I think it really defied expectations. And I've written elsewhere about some of the reasons for that. But one of the reasons is the idea of the four faithful friends, or these communitarian values. So in this article that appeared in The Atlantic, this woman, Namgye Zam, was quoted as saying, "I've complained about small society syndrome and how suffocating it can get, but I believe it was this very closeness that has kept us together. I don't think any other country can say that leaders and ordinary people enjoy such mutual trust. This is the main reason for Bhutan's success." So again, I just think it's a way of thinking about things differently, and a provocation for how might we think about our local politics, maybe our national politics, differently. And then how do we rethink the politics and the social contract? A guiding principle of Bhutan's development program is the principle of gross national happiness, which is based on these 4 pillars of sustainable and equitable socioeconomic development, good government, preservation of the natural environment, and preservation of culture. These 4 pillars have been articulated for about 30, 40 years. There's sort of an apocryphal saying from the third king who said gross national happiness is more important than gross national product. It turns out when you try to actually trace when that happened, it's very hard to actually figure out when that happened. There's a lot of debate about that. I've written about that elsewhere as well. But this concept has resonated throughout Bhutan and has attracted the attention of ecological economists and other people who are kind of trying to rethink how we structure our economies and our economy and society together. So the Gross National Happiness Center, the GNH Center, has developed those 4 pillars into these 9 domains of gross national happiness, which they monitor through a national survey every 5 years. And they send enumerators out through the countryside to conduct interviews with ordinary people throughout the country and find out their experience with these 9 domains, which include living standards, education, health, environment, community vitality, time use, psychological well-being, good governance, and cultural preservation. So they're trying to monitor these indicators on a regular basis. Again, quite different than what we do here. And the incorporation, for example, of psychological well-being as well as health, the incorporation of cultural vitality and environment along with economic indicators gives us a way to expand how we think about what's important in society. So ultimately, I think that all of this gives us a different model for thinking about how to cultivate biocultural resilience. And in this time of climate chaos, immense change, immense social change, political change, we need the ability to weather and withstand these drastic waves of change. How do we do that? There's, of course, lots of discussion about different ways, but these are some of the ideas that have been inspired by my observation and research in Bhutan. This idea of an ethic of care for other humans and also for non-human nature that Merchant alluded to in the beginning, and that we've heard in a number of presentations throughout this week. Ideas about humility and vulnerability, which really became prevalent during the COVID pandemic in Bhutan. They recognized their vulnerability to the pandemic. They recognized that they didn't have like a lot of pulmonologists and expert doctors. And then they looked at the strengths and resources that they did have and worked with those, which again include caring and cultural cohesion. The emphasis on relationships and mutual aid was a really big piece of their response to the COVID pandemic, as well as collective action, looking what people could do together, and extending care to non-human beings because of this idea that one could possibly be reincarnated as a non-human being, and how would we want to be treated if we were in that spot. The attention to the value of water, which of course we've seen in North America too with the water protectors, the Standing Rock protests. But I think that much of the time we are not enough cognizant of the centrality of water to life. That's what people say, right? Water is life. But really being cognizant of that, protecting sacred waters as a way of acknowledging the value of water. And then positioning economic values in a larger context. So in this model that I've developed, the largest context is the ecosphere. It's not the economy. The economy is in the middle, and it's influenced by Buddhism, but it's also influenced by these landscape spirits and deities that shape how humans and non-human nature interrelate. The landscape deities are sort of mediaries between humans and nature. And then this is all in the context of Buddhism and the ecosphere. And I'll give you 1 second. So this is how I think things are working in Bhutan, and again, a provocation for us to think about how we could organize things differently. So learn to love the environment, think properly before it is too late. Nature is home to all. Thank you for your kind attention. Matt?
Thank you, Elizabeth, for this research, which I know you've been doing for almost 2 decades.
Yeah.
So much that we can learn from Bhutan. And I wonder if you could speak a little bit more about when Guru and Rinpoche brought Buddhism to Bhutan as an existing indigenous tradition. How did that interface work? Are there more lessons to learn there?
Thank you.
Like a few of the things you mentioned, these ritual dances of Guru and Rinpoche subduing the local deities, and that made me wonder what that relationship was like years ago when I heard. Yeah, so if you could just.
Yeah. Fantastic. Thank you so much for asking that question, because that's something I get into and would have liked to get into, but didn't elaborate on for time. So that's perfect. So what I think is really interesting is that when Buddhism came to Bhutan, it did not eliminate the local deities like in Europe, where they got suppressed and pressed underground. They did get subdued, or not, So there's a lot of stories about battles between Guru Rinpoche and various unruly or even malevolent deities. And what usually happened is he subdued them and made them sworn protectors of the Dharma. So they kind of got converted to Buddhism, but they also maintained their own agency and their own landscapes, and their own identity. I mean, they weren't eliminated, like witches and healers in early modern Europe. So this is, I think, really kind of a crux of the issue, is that the landscape deities are alive and active, and they work together with Buddhism. Like many of them have become sworn, like they swore an oath to protect the Dharma, and so then you see them in temples and monasteries. You see their images, but they were not eliminated. So I think it's a productive tension. Scholars argue about how it exactly works, but my view, especially in relation to non-human nature, which fewer Tibetan studies scholars focus on, is that it's a very productive dynamic tension, that they are sworn protectors, but they also can get unruly. They need to have their offerings and their rituals to maintain their beneficence, and they demand reciprocity. They can deliver benefits and prosperity and boons, if people engage with them properly. And when people don't, they can punish severely. And there are countless tales of this, including from very well educated, even foreign educated Bhutanese folks. I think really something for us to learn from in terms of how a human engages with their surroundings, their human and non-human surroundings, and the ways that we are in reciprocity with others, human and non-human others. Is that, yeah, thanks. Why don't you pass it to Alexis right there?
So much. This is great. I have so many questions and I wrote it down, but through your research, like as I'm thinking about this, I'm thinking about the population of Bhutan, I'm thinking about, I guess, scalability, or how you see these models being deployed other places where there's not a
Yeah.
it's kind of not fully formed, but
Yeah.
scalability and how we can, how you're learning through your research, how it may be.
Yeah. Yeah, great point. I think scalability like would emerge from the ground up. I think there's plenty of reasons why we wouldn't want it to be a sort of top down, but since I said like this idea of provocation, like what ideas would any one of you want to take to your local community, whether that's a political community, a town, a region, or an affinity community. Like I think there's many different ideas that we can take in different ways to different places where we live, work, and play. And so whether it's ideas about the value of life or ideas about landscape deities and listening to them, like I think there's just different pieces that can be applied in different contexts. And I think also just the idea that we can even shift our way of thinking. You were talking about listening to the land, right? And deep listening, right? That like even that can be world changing. And so there are these possibilities that we can perhaps drop seeds into different places where we're working. But more practically, there have been gross national happiness initiatives in the US. There was one in Vermont. There was one, I think, in upstate New York. There have been like different sort of seedings of that. There is a Gross National Happiness International project. So that idea is also then influencing how people think about economies and how people think about international development, and just trying to maybe have more values incorporated into economic development than only the economic part. Yeah, thanks. Stephen?
Great, thanks. Wonderful. If you call any of those deities, I have some places I know. I'm curious about how Bhutan is dealing with, like, lack of a better term, the infestation of sort of Western values and everything, and also dealing with their youth and how they may be more aware of the outside. So how do they buffer and sort of manage through that to maintain the integrity of a lot of these cultural norms?
Excellent. Yeah, thanks. But I actually want to like pick up your very first comment, because a Bhutanese woman once told me, you must have killed all your deities, and that's why you paved over all of America. Right? So I think that we have the possibility of learning, from the local land carers about our local deities, and they're here. So like even like that, I think it would be a really big shift. So now I'll take your more pragmatic part. There is definitely a challenge with the youth. There is no doubt. And when I first went there, television had just been introduced. Television had not been allowed before 1999. And so suddenly they got inundated with these wild images. Like we all grew up with TV, right? And we knew it wasn't real, and we sort of knew that it was edited and that there was a lot of make-believe behind it. They just suddenly got all these images from 57 channels from Thailand, and it was really confusing. And I think that's actually part of the reason for the Gross National Happiness Center, is that promotion and preservation of culture, is to try to connect younger generations with their history. There's also a bunch of institutes called Zorg Chusum Institutes that teach these 13 traditional arts and crafts in a structured manner. So it used to be kind of a just looser apprentice mentor system, but now like students can go to the Zorg Chusum schools and learn this, and learn how to be like culture conveyors into the future. But a lot of my friends that I came up with live in Australia now, and I think it's tough because there's limited economic opportunities And for people who were really curious and became really educated, like the opportunities are mostly outside. All of them want to go back and retire. And when my friends have visited the US, they're like, well, this is just way too much. Like, I can't wait to go home. So the government has worked and continues to work on expanding opportunity in the rural areas, building more hospitals and schools and telecommunications infrastructure. They've done a great job with IT, and like everyone has a cell phone. And so they're like consciously working with it rather than just ignoring it or just being like, well, it's a march of progress. But it's a contested issue for sure, and people want different amounts of modernization and globalization, and it's really an ongoing process. Yeah. Please, Anta.
That's a complicated question, I think. Start with an assumption.
Mm-hmm.
Simplify it, tell me if this is wrong. So the assumption is that these deities and their
Yeah.
yeah, any practical advice on how we learn ours? Because like go off and
That's awesome. Yeah. Yeah, thank you. Also, because that is something I would have loved to talk about and didn't. So I think, again, the process or the idea of deep listening that we heard about from Alexis right before this was super helpful. So I went for a hike yesterday on the land to think about all this and the structure and what I wanted to share. And I was asking the land, and I was shown a couple places where there is a lu, which is the spirit of prosperity. And it asked me to take a picture, and I did. And I think that just like being open to that and I actually kept walking. I was like, and they were like, no, I really want you to take, and I was like, okay, all right, I'm taking a picture. So a lu can be found where there's a large rock and a tree, and there's often a spring there. And so I've just, on my walks, even in my neighborhood, I've just started paying attention and trying to listen and trying to see what appears. And I think it was somebody else who said, well, like, what if, is it your imagination, but does it matter, right? Because it's a process of listening and paying attention and being receptive to the landscape. I imagine, well, I'm positive that the names of the spirits are different here. I don't know their names. I was going to say I imagine that they might be different, but they might be the same. They might be like the same sort of archetypes, right? But I think we really need to be in contact with the traditional knowledge holders to find out. But I also think there's a sort of intuitive receptivity that can be practiced and developed, just like any other skill that we have. That the more we practice it, the more we can access it. So for me, that's what I've just started paying attention to is when I get that intuitive feeling that like something has something to say, that I just try to pay attention to it and receive it and see what happens. And it helps. Thank you.
Thank you so much for this talk. There's so much what I've done and I've done like we're India, human nature, very similar ideas. I encountered the growth and leaving it doesn't matter for me. And even virtually.
Wow.
In all the places where I've been, I'm so surprised about how being together with the land. Then there's also plastic.
Yeah.
So I'm wondering.
Yeah, absolutely.
What's that been found?
Yeah. Yeah, so a whole nother piece of this project that I didn't talk about at all. I've studied waste in Bhutan a lot. I'm probably the world's expert, maybe not the world expert. There's a couple others who study it, but I've studied it a lot, and it's certainly a very niche issue. And when I went back in 2008, that's what the government asked me to do. They were we got to get a handle on this waste project problem. So one of my observations was that when India liberalized their economy in the 80s, that just opened the faucet for tons of manufactured stuff to come into India and then into Bhutan. And again, there wasn't the infrastructure or even the intellectual infrastructure for dealing with it. I grew up with commercials saying, "Don't throw your can out the window and keep America beautiful." But stuff just appeared in a very short period of time, and people before that they had lived in an organic economy. Everything was handmade, and there was very little imported stuff, and everything came from the earth and went back to the earth. So people were used to just dropping stuff wherever, and it would return to soil. So over the last couple decades, it's been a real struggle to figure out how to implement waste management systems, and how to inculcate that idea of taking care of waste. One hypothesis I have also is that manufactured stuff doesn't really fit into the Tsipa Korlo. It doesn't really fit into the wheel of life. And so there's just well, wait, so what do we have to kind of rethink everything in order to deal with this stuff. And another thing I noticed was that shiny wrappers are not considered contaminating in any way, right? Because they're clean and shiny and pristine. And so they don't generate any sort of feeling of revulsion or feeling of I want to get rid of this. If I put it here, it's really no problem. So so that has been a real effort to handle litter and manufactured waste. And I think it just really raises a lot of questions about a circular economy. I've written about that elsewhere, and then how to rethink an economy towards a circular economy so that materials that are no longer needed can be the raw materials for something else rather than just something that we have to push away. Right. Well, there was a great practice of reuse before there was a lot of imported manufactured material. The few things that were imported were reused for cooking oil and water. Bottles were reused for cooking oil and water, and the homebrewed alcohol. And but yeah, planting flowers. There's a notable Lama who teaches internationally, Dzongzar Khyentse Rinpoche, who has tried to start rethinking and repurposing waste as a spiritual practice, and leads a whole, I've written about this elsewhere too, leads workshops to teach people to make artisanal products out of wrappers and bottles and stuff, which I think is another way of sort of connecting it back into the life cycle. But I also think we need to stop the source of those products that can't be reused. Yeah, thanks. I saw Jake, or are you done? Okay.
No, it's okay. I'll talk to you about that.
Yeah. Okay. Sure. All right. Well, I know we're past time, unless someone, or you can come talk to me. Here, just come talk to me. Yeah, because we're past time.